The Roaring Twenties was an era marked by excess rebellion and the rhythm of jazz filling the air. The decade boasted an atmosphere of excitement, yet beneath the lively tunes and flapper skirts lay an empire of shadows. At the helm of this empire was Alphonse Gabriel Capone, or as he became known, Al Capone, or more ominously Scarface. With his stranglehold over Chicago, Capone became a symbol of the brutal reality of organized crime, orchestrating a kingdom where fear and violence prevailed. The seemingly glamorous days of the Roaring Twenties were in many ways underpinned by the deadly operations of Capone and his associates. Capone's gang, the Chicago outfit, became infamous for its cold-blooded tactics. The use of a Chicago overcoat, a euphemism for a coffin and the Chicago typewriter, the term for a Thompson submachine gun, became synonymous with Capone's reign of terror. His methods were brutal but effective, and he maintained power through a chilling philosophy. You can get much farther with a kind word and a gun than you can with a kind word alone. This belief was the cornerstone of Capone's rule, ensuring that anyone who stood in his way would face violent consequences. Capone's ability to inspire fear while maintaining an image of power and control made him an almost untouchable figure in both the underworld and public perception. Al Capone wasn't just a ruthless mob boss. He was a master manipulator who understood the power of fear. His ability to inspire terror allowed him to solidify his reign over Chicago using extreme violence to eliminate his rivals. Capone became a major figure, not just for his brutal ways, but for his intelligence and strategic thinking. From controlling the alcohol trade to running illegal gambling operations, Capone's empire was expansive. But behind the power was a man who wasn't just feared. He was respected by his followers, making him a pivotal figure in the world of organized crime. His empire was vast, operating under a network that permeated every facet of the criminal underworld, influencing the daily lives of Chicago's citizens and corrupting public institutions. Capone's early life and ascent to power. Al Capone's ascent to power in Chicago was swift and relentless, rooted in both his raw ambition and his sharp street instincts. Born on January 17, 1899 in Brooklyn, New York, to Italian immigrants Gabriel and Teresa Capone, Al's path diverged early from that of his family's pursuit of the American dream. Instead, he was drawn into the streets where he joined gangs like the Brooklyn Rippers and the 40 Thieves Juniors. These early encounters with crime set the stage for Capone's future in the world of organized criminal syndicates. His upbringing in the tough streets of Brooklyn taught him the value of loyalty, survival, and manipulation, the skills that would later serve him in his rise to power. Capone's real break came when he met Johnny Torrio, a seasoned figure in the Chicago underworld, who would become Capone's mentor. Under Torrio's guidance, Capone was introduced to the city's most lucrative criminal enterprises, particularly bootlegging. The Volstead Act of 1919, which introduced prohibition, served as a catalyst for organized crime. Capone, ever opportunistic, saw the chance to capitalize on the public's thirst for alcohol, and in doing so he established a vast network for distributing illicit booze throughout Chicago. Prohibition created an environment ripe for exploitation, and Capone's ruthless instincts allowed him to rise to prominence quickly. By 1925, Torrio, who had mentored Capone, retired due to an assassination attempt, handing over the reins to Capone. Capone didn't just take over Torrio's operations. He expanded them, using his brutality and sharp business acumen to take control of the entire city. Gambling, prostitution, and racketeering became additional sources of revenue as Capone built his criminal empire. His ruthlessness became legend as his methods of enforcement left a trail of bodies across Chicago. Capone's takeover marked the beginning of an era of fear in the city, one that would take years for law enforcement to even begin to challenge. Capone's reputation as a gangster grew alongside his empire. His reign over Chicago wasn't just about crime. It was about manipulating every part of society to maintain his grip on power. His criminal empire flourished under the shroud of prohibition, and he maintained control not just through fear, but through manipulation of the police force, city officials, and public opinion. His skill at navigating the city's politics and bribing officials ensured that Capone's empire remained nearly untouchable, despite the best efforts of law enforcement. By the time Capone truly ascended to power, his name had become synonymous with both Chicago's underworld and the violent, lawless era of Prohibition. Capone's reign was an ET without opposition, though rival factions like the North Side Gang, led by George Bugs Moran, often clashed with Capone's men. The violence between these two factions became a hallmark of the 1920s gangster wars, marked by brutal shootouts and retaliatory killings that tore through the streets of Chicago. Moran, a notorious gangster in his own right, had his sights set on taking control of the city's bootlegging operations, and his ambitions put him directly in Capone's crosshairs. Moran's gang, though not as large or influential as Capone's, was determined to stake a claim in the growing alcohol trade, and this drew the attention of Capone's enforcers. The rivalry between Capone and Moran escalated into a deadly war that defined the criminal landscape of the 1920s. Violence became a daily occurrence in Chicago, as both sides fought for dominance in the bootlegging business, which had become the city's most lucrative illegal trade. Capone's methods were brutal, using extreme violence and intimidation to eliminate his competition. Moran, equally ruthless, responded in kind, but Capone's larger network and greater resources gave him an upper hand. In 1929, the tension reached its bloody apex with the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. On February 14, 1929, Capone's men staged an ambush that would become one of the most infamous incidents in gangster history. 7 members of Moran's gang were lined up against a wall and executed in a garage on North Clark Street. The attackers, dressed as police officers, were able to get close enough to their targets to open fire, with Tommy guns mowing down their victims in a bloody display of power. The massacre was a cold-blooded message from Capone's men, showing their dominance in the underworld and sending a chilling signal to anyone who dared challenge their authority. Despite Capone being in Florida at the time, and the lack of direct evidence tying him to the massacre, it was widely believed that he orchestrated the bloodbath. The murder of Moran's men was a dramatic demonstration of Capone's willingness to use any means necessary to maintain his grip on Chicago's criminal empire. The massacre not only eliminated his rivals, but also shocked the city and the nation. While Capone's public image had been carefully crafted to present him as a man of the people, this violent act made it impossible for him to maintain any semblance of legitimacy. The aftermath of the massacre marked a turning point in the public's view of Capone. While he had previously maintained a Robin Hood-like image by contributing to charities and providing for the community, his violent methods became impossible to ignore. The massacre escalated the ongoing battle between Capone and rival gangs in Chicago, and it set off a wave of law enforcement investigations. Authorities, now under intense public pressure, ramped up their efforts to dismantle Capone's empire. Despite Capone's public popularity and charm, the brutality of his actions, exemplified by the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, made it clear that the reign of Al Capone would not last forever. As Al Capone's empire expanded throughout Chicago, his methods of maintaining control over his criminal network grew increasingly brutal. Capone was not just a ruthless mob boss. He was a man who wielded fear like a weapon, using it to keep his subordinates in check and send a message to anyone who dared challenge his authority. His gang was built on loyalty, and any hint of disloyalty was met with severe punishment. This was not a world for the faint of heart, and those who worked for Capone were keenly aware that any mistake, no matter how small, could result in a violent end. Capone controlled his empire through violence and fear. He had a network of enforcers and hitmen who did his dirty work, carrying out brutal acts of punishment against anyone who crossed him. Physical beatings were common, and Capone used these to instill discipline within his organization. These beatings were not just a form of punishment. They were a warning to anyone who might consider defying him. The fear of violent retribution was so widespread that even the most hardened criminals knew that crossing Capone meant certain death. But Capone's methods of punishment didn't stop at beatings. He was rumored to have employed a variety of other methods, including the use of cigarette burns to mark those who disrespected him. These brutal acts of violence were part of Capone's larger strategy to control not just his gang, but the entire city of Chicago. His use of terror created a climate where his authority was absolute, and anyone who dared challenge it would pay the ultimate price. Capone's fear-driven rule allowed him to expand his criminal empire without opposition. His enforcers ensured that his control was maintained, and his violent acts instilled fear in both his criminal associates and the general public. Perhaps the most infamous of Capone's violent methods was his alleged use of an ice pick. There are numerous accounts of Capone ordering or personally using an ice pick to inflict pain on those who threatened his empire. The chilling stories surrounding these acts painted a picture of a man who would stop at nothing to maintain his control. But it wasn't just the use of weapons that made Capone feared. It was his ability to make others fear him. Capone's power was built on intimidation, and it worked. His reputation was so entrenched in the public consciousness that even those outside the criminal world recognized the name Scarface with a sense of dread. Another infamous story from Capone's reign involves his use of a baseball bat. Capone, a lover of baseball, reportedly used a baseball bat as a tool for punishment, and one of the most notorious incidents occurred during a banquet he hosted. In front of his guests, Capone allegedly took a baseball bat to 3 men whom he suspected had betrayed him. The brutal killings took place in front of a horrified audience, and the message was clear. Loyalty was everything, and anyone who faltered would meet a gruesome end. This event only served to strengthen Capone's reputation for cruelty, cementing his role as a powerful and feared figure in the Chicago underworld. Despite the brutality of Capone's reign, there was a strange respect from his followers. To them, Capone was not just a boss. He was a leader who demanded unwavering loyalty. His violent methods were seen as necessary to maintain order and discipline within the gang in a world where betrayal and disloyalty could lead to death. Capone's brutal methods ensured that his empire remained intact, and no one dared challenge him without facing the consequences. However, as history would show, no empire is built to last forever. The public's growing distaste for Capone's violent methods, coupled with the relentless efforts of law enforcement, would eventually lead to his downfall. The forces of justice began to close in on Capone, and the end of his reign was inevitable. The relentless pursuit of Capone by law enforcement, the escalating violence of his reign, and the pressure from rival criminal organizations ultimately led to his downfall. Despite his attempts to avoid justice through bribery, corruption and manipulation of the system, Capone was eventually taken down not by his violent actions but by his inability to maintain his financial secrecy. In 1931, he was convicted of tax evasion, a crime that had little to do with his reign of terror, but became the means of bringing him to justice. Capone's once unassailable empire crumbled, and the world saw the end of an era. His imprisonment marked the final chapter in his rise and fall, solidifying his legacy as one of the most infamous gangsters in history. Capone's story, full of violence and bloodshed, serves as a warning of how unchecked power manipulation and brutality can shape an empire. But it also highlights how such empires ultimately collapse under the weight of their own violence. Al Capone's empire, once a symbol of fear and dominance, faded away as his criminal activities came to an end. But his name remains synonymous with the darkest days of organized crime in America. His story is a chilling reminder of the fine line between power and downfall, and the inevitable consequences of living by the sword.